Going out and creating work orders on demand is obviously a very common practice that you would work with based upon your business model. But fact of the matter is a lot of organizations enter into preventative maintenance contracts with their customers. So now they have situations where, we've sold you this product and now we want to go out and we want to make sure that we keep it running at its optimal performance for, forever or a certain length of time depending upon the agreed upon terms. And when you start talking about those situations, now you start talking about, we need to have these work orders being scheduled at regular intervals. Maybe it's once a week, maybe it's once every 2 weeks or a couple times a month. Whatever the situation is, there's often times where being able to create preventative maintenance contracts allows you to automatically create and schedule work orders based upon predetermined requirements. And that's really what we want to talk about in this module is how can you utilize the agreement functionality to be able to facilitate that. So we want to provide you with just a quick little overview of how agreements work inside field service. What are they and how are they different from some of the other aspects of the application? We're going to talk a little bit about how you create them and how you manage them in the system and what are the specific elements that you need to do to make sure that they are creating work orders at a predefined schedule. We're going to talk a little bit about bookings. So how do you auto-generate bookings based upon agreements? So how do we go out and make sure that these work orders are not only being created but scheduled automatically at regular intervals? And then when you have an agreement, oftentimes you want to invoice on regular occurrences as well. So we may be going out twice a month and servicing a specific piece of equipment, but we also need to generate invoices on a regular scheduled basis as well. So how do you define what that schedule looks like from an invoicing standpoint as well? What exactly is an agreement in field service? Well, think of an agreement as a framework that you can use to auto-generate work orders and invoices. So anytime you have something that needs to generate a work order on some type of reoccurring schedule for any specific length of time. So I have a scenario where we're going to go out once a month for the next 2 years and we're going to have somebody come out and do an on-site inspection. So I want to make sure that at the first of the month that somebody is dispatched out, that a work order is automatically created, that work order understands what work needs to be done and what type of information needs to be included on that work order, and then goes out and creates the work order and schedules somebody to go out and conduct that information. Now, what's nice when you start talking about agreements is we can define schedules for multiple work order creation situations. And so, it might be a scenario where you're a landscape company or you're an organization that maybe provides multiple services to a customer based upon a specific a contract that you have defined within them. And so, for example, if I look at this lawn care situation, I might have multiple bookings. So I'm going to create an agreement, and within that agreement, I'm going to define 2 separate bookings. The first one is going to be a weekly schedule for somebody to go out and actually provide lawn care. So maybe they're going to go out and they're going to mow the lawn every Tuesday for the next 12 months or whatever that situation would be. But in addition to that, I'm not just going to mow your lawn. Every 2 weeks, I'm going to have somebody go out and they're going to do some landscaping scenarios. They're going to prune the hedges, they're going to do some edging around the landscaping, maybe they're going to wash your windows, but they're going to do a little bit more advanced lawn care that doesn't necessarily need to be done every single week. And then at the same point in time, I'm still going to package these 2 items together, and I'm still going to send you, once a month an invoice for all of the services that I'm providing. So within this concept of this agreement, I now have the availability to go in and define multiple scheduling scenarios. I can create the overall agreement, and then I can create the setup for the weekly maintenance, the bi-weekly maintenance, and then the actual monthly maintenance, and then I can trigger the monthly invoice setup in the system based upon those items. So anytime you are really going through preventative maintenance or service contracts with your customers, you can leverage the power of agreements to really auto-generate this information based upon unique requirements that each customer might have. Agreements have a few different components that make them up. They have the overall agreement itself, and the overall agreement is where we're going to go in and we're going to define things like the service account and the billing account, much like we would do from a work order standpoint. We're also going to define the agreement date details. So when does this agreement end, or start? When does this agreement end? And then we also have different statuses for those, as well as defining any work orders that are being created as part of this agreement. What price list do we want to use? What service territory are we going to use, and whether or not they're taxable? Now, within that agreement, then we will also have what are called the booking setups and the invoice setups. And those are going to define the specific schedules on which these work orders and these bookings are going to be created in the system, as well as the invoices. But let's first look at it from an agreement level first. So we'll go in and we'll create an agreement, kind of the overall structure of it, and then we can come back and talk about some of the other stuff in a little bit more detail. Inside Dynamics 365, I'm going to navigate to Field Service, and I'm going to navigate to Agreements. And I'm going to create a new agreement. So I'll go in here and click on New. So now what I want to define is again, really just the basic architecture or the basic structure of this agreement. So who is this agreement for? I'm going to define the service account. The billing account will auto-populate based upon what service account that I worked with, but just like work orders, I could change it if I needed to. Now, all agreements are going to come in an estimate status, which basically means that I'm not going to start generating any work orders until this agreement has been activated inside the system. So as I've gone in and created the structure and defined all the information that's in there, once it's ready for me to start auto-generating information in the application, I can change the status to active. Once it's gone through and it's reached its expiration dates, then the status will automatically change to expired. So once it's activated in the system, then it's going to start auto-generating that information. Now, agreements also have this concept, just like work orders do, of substatuses. So if this is sitting in estimate status because we're waiting for the customer to approve the terms of the agreement, we can have that denoted inside the application as well. Now, as I scroll down into the start and end date, this is where I can define specifics around when this agreement is actually going to work. Now, for our purposes today, I'll just go ahead and pick today as the starting end date, and I will pick 1 year from today as the ending date, and that'll go ahead and populate the duration. Now, this is also going to be useful when we start going in and defining the actual bookings that are going to be set up inside the application, because it's going to utilize those dates when it starts creating some of the reoccurrence patterns that are going to be used. And then as I go down, I also have the ability for this to define what specific price list I want to use. So again, we talked about the concept of price lists being able to be associated with specific products, with accounts, with work orders, or with agreements. Now I can go ahead and say any work order that's being generated from this agreement is going to use this price list. We know that any work order being generated from this agreement is also going to belong to the Washington service territory, and because it's going to be taxable information, we're also going to go ahead and use our standard out-of-state tax rate. So we now have the structure of the agreement set up, and we can now start building on that from there. But before we do that, I want to take just a second. We'll hop back in and we'll talk a little bit about how you can use booking setups as well. When it comes time to say, okay, here's the work orders that I want to have created, or here's the invoices that I want to have created, I can configure the system to auto-generate that information. So a work order could be auto-created based upon specific settings that I define in what's called a booking setup. Now, what's interesting about the booking setups is not only do I have the ability to define, when the work order is created or how often the work order is created, but I also can populate things around the priority, the service tasks. This is where I can also attach incident types to that information to ensure that everything is going to display the way that I want to. Now, let's talk just a little bit about these booking setups. So there's a few different items that you're going to have to define when you create a booking in the system. The first one is more around your summary information. And so that's really going to define, what the name of it is, who the owner of that particular agreement is, what the agreement number is, the description. This is also where I would go in and at a high level define things like the service tasks and the products and services that are going to be used specifically around the agreement. So this is where I would basically say, okay, here's what we're going to call this, here's how we're going to pre-populate it, here's the tasks, services, and skill sets that are going to need to be pushed over into the work order at the time when the work order is created. Then you need to get into your work order settings. And so this is where you're going to define things around, is this work order going to be auto-generated? So if the system auto-generates the work order, what type of work order is it going to auto-generate? Is it going to be a preventative maintenance work order? Is it going to be an inspection work order? And then how many days in advance do we need to generate this? Now, when we go in and actually do the demonstration on this here in just a couple of seconds, I want to talk more about the how many days in advance in the schedule, because there are a couple of things that you need to be aware of on that. But then the other thing that I can do within the work order settings is this is where I can also define the priority of the work order. So you think about your typical preventative maintenance work order, it's probably not going to be real high priority. You probably have a little bit of flexibility around when it's scheduled and those things. So if something happens where there's an emergency, maybe this has a lower priority, so it kind of gets put onto the back burner until some of the more immediate situations are taken care of. You also need to define the bookings. So I want to create the work order right away, but when I create the work order, do I also want a booking to be created? And if I have that booking created, who is going to be the resource that is associated with that booking? What is the estimated duration? And do I have any flexibility? So again, if it can I schedule it 1 or 2 days out, or does it have to be scheduled for the day that the work order was actually created on? And then the final thing is preferences. Do I have any preferred resources? If I'm going to generate that information, is there preferred start times or maintenance windows that we want to work with? So when you're defining the actual bookings, there's a fair amount of information that needs to be set up and configured that's really going to control when those things show inside the application. So let's go ahead and create a booking for this agreement and see how that process works. In my work order, in my agreement, I can see over here I have a booking setup. So this is where I'm going to define those bookings. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on my plus sign to add a booking. And now once this populates, this is where I can start defining those specifics that we talked about on that initial slide. So I'm going to call this maybe, weekly service. Now I'm going to define, do I want to auto-generate the work order? Yes, I do. What type of work order is this going to be? We're going to call this preventative maintenance. And then how many days in advance do I want to generate this? So if this is a situation where, it's going to be generated, every Monday, or it needs to be done every single Monday, what this allows me to do is to say, okay, 2 days before this or 3 days before this, I want to auto-generate the work order so I can get it on the schedule and I can find somebody to work with it. Now, this is where you have to be a little bit careful on what type of agreement it is. If I'm generating this work order on the 1st of the month, and it's a monthly situation, it's okay to do 3, 4, 5 days in advance. If I'm doing this weekly, I maybe don't want to schedule it 4 or 5 days in advance because now I might have some overlap if we're running behind. So just be cognizant of the fact that, if you say that this is a weekly scenario, you may want to set your generate work order days in advance to, 1 or 2 to avoid the potential of any overlap if you don't necessarily get that scheduled right away in the system. Now I'm going to just go ahead and say 1 day in advance, and because this is a maintenance type of work order, I'm going to go ahead and set this to low. And now I'm going to move up into the booking settings. So that's the work order. It says, okay, I want to create the work order X number of days in advance. Now I'm going to define the booking settings. So within the booking settings, do I want to auto-generate the booking itself? If I do want to have the booking be auto-generated or basically auto-scheduled for me, then I need to come down into here for where it says preferred resource, and I need to define who that resource is that we're going to work with, because this is ultimately the person that it's going to try to schedule within the system itself. Now I also have the capabilities when I do this, I do also need to specify a start time or a preferred start time in the system, because now it is also going to go out and try to schedule this resource for that time. Now, if I don't want to auto-generate the booking, I don't necessarily have to worry about the preferences scenario. But if I have some flexibility around pre-booking flexibility or post-booking flexibility, if it doesn't necessarily need to be scheduled that day, I can now say, schedule it 1 day in advance or 1 day post. And so now if it's scheduled to be done on Monday, I could say it could also be scheduled on Sunday, or it could be scheduled on Tuesday. Now, if I don't work on Sunday, I would have the ability to come in here and just say, you know what, don't schedule it on that. Let's leave this one empty. And now let's just say that I have 2 days flexibility. So it could either be scheduled on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. But that kind of goes back to what we talked about here with the generate in advance, because now if you're giving yourself that post-booking flexibility and you're scheduling or generating stuff 3-4 days in advance, you could have some overlap. So just be aware of that potential overlap within the system itself. Now, at this point, I can go ahead and I can save this. And this is going to create the booking. Now, the other thing to this is I need to understand, or I need to determine when it creates this, do I want to pre-populate anything based upon incidents? So I can come into here where it says incidents, and I can click on my plus sign to add my incidents. And now I have the ability to define if there's any incidents on here that I want to use to pre-populate it. So I'm going to pick my incident type. I'll pick one, a camera down. I'll go ahead and hit save and close. And now it is going to, when it generates the work order, it'll create all of the characteristics, it'll create all of the service tasks as well as the services and the products based upon the information that's defined for this incident. Now, the other aspect to this is I could add multiple incidents to this, and all of the products and services and tasks would all just stack on top of what I've had defined within that scenario. So if I wanted to, I could add multiple incidents in here and have that associated accordingly. Now, the other scenario is, now that I've got this created, maybe I want to set this up to reoccur this booking on a regular scheduled basis. And so up here where it says booking reoccurrence, this is where I could add a reoccurrence pattern around this booking. So now I could come into here and say this is going to happen every week on Monday, starting on today and ending by the end of the service contract. And now when I hit save on this, once I activate this agreement inside the system, once a week it is going to start generating this information accordingly, and then I will start seeing these work orders and these bookings being populated inside the system. Now, I'm going to close this booking down, and we mentioned the flexibility. So this is my weekly service situation. Now I could come in here and create another option specifically for monthly service, or maybe a monthly inspection that we need to work with. So now I have the ability through the same agreement to generate multiple work order creations. So we'll call this one monthly service. We'll say, yes, we want to generate that. Same type of situation. It's going to be preventative maintenance. We're going to generate this one, let's say 3 days in advance. Low priority. We're going to auto-generate the bookings with 2 days flexibility on either end. We prefer Derek. 9 a.m. Save this. I'll add my incident just for ease purposes. Then I'll hit my reoccurrence, and this one I will set up as a monthly occurrence to occur, let's just say on the first day of every month. And now I can see that within this one agreement, I have multiple bookings. And so now I have the ability to go out and have multiple items scheduled and multiple items billed based upon the specific intervals that I've defined. When you're creating the bookings, it makes sense that you might have a weekly work order, you might have a monthly work order, you might have, a bi-monthly work order. Oftentimes, no matter how you're defining how those work orders or those bookings are going to be created, typically from an invoicing standpoint, you're probably only going to invoice once a month, or you have a very set schedule in which you want to invoice. And depending upon the type of agreement that you've entered in with that, customer, you probably are going to invoice based upon, specific predefined products that were associated with that maintenance agreement. And so invoices can be done much the same way as bookings can be done. You can create a specific reoccurrence pattern just for invoices, or you could create a one-time invoice and you could generate it within the application. But what's nice about the invoices is not only can I define the invoice itself, but I can also define what products I want to invoice as part of that particular invoice. So let's take a look at setting up an invoice inside the application. So now if I scroll down into invoice setups and I click on my plus sign for invoice setups, it's the same type of process. It just doesn't necessarily have as much information as we would do from a booking standpoint. So what do I want to call this? I'm going to call this monthly invoice. I'm going to hit save. Now on my invoice products, I'm going to add the products that would need to be included on this invoice. So they may be pre-packaged service items that we've kind of defined. They may be set product options that we want to show within here. We'll just do kind of a set product so you can see. I'll choose my product. I'll choose my quantity. Choose my price, let's say 150. And now as it goes through and defines what those situations are, now it's going to build that particular item. So I'll hit save and close. And then I could add multiple options to that based upon the item. But now when it generates the invoice, it's going to look at the price list that's associated with the invoice, and that's how it's going to calculate some of that information if I had done specific products or based upon the flat fee that I had designated. Now, just like I had done, I can hit invoice reoccurrence. I can say that we're going to invoice this monthly on the first, or let's do the last day of the month this time. Save my information. And now my agreement is set up. I have my agreement set up. I have both my bookings defined as well as my invoices defined. Now all I would have to do in the system is change the status to active. And once I save this and I activate this in the system, based upon where you are at in the month and how you had defined when things should be auto-generated, you will start to see bookings as well as work orders, and then even invoices start to be auto-generated. They will show up available to be scheduled on the schedule board unless you had dictated that the booking be created, and then the booking would be set up in the application from there. But this is a great way that you can auto-populate things on a schedule based upon specific needs. Before we end our discussion on agreements, just a couple things to consider or take in mind when you start working with agreements. As we talked about, a single agreement can have numerous agreement schedules. So really be aware of when you need to generate that information, and you may be able to accomplish it with a single agreement and just multiple bookings that are set up inside that agreement to accommodate the weekly, the monthly, the annually, so on and so forth. The other thing to remember is by creating that agreement and specifying the price list for that agreement, that is also going to make sure that when the work orders and the items are created based upon that agreement, that all of the products and services will use that price list. So the price list specifies what price or where to pull the price for all the products and services that are related to any work order created from that agreement. Now, all it's doing when it creates the work order based upon that agreement is it's just utilizing the framework that you defined for that initial creation. All of that information can be edited. So if you do need to go in and for this particular work order, just make some slight modifications, you do have the capabilities to do that. So don't think of that, the information being populated as permanent. Think of it more as an auto-population scenario that if you ever need to overwrite at a work order level, you absolutely have the flexibility to do that. When your organization is doing a lot of preventative maintenance, you want to find easy ways to go ahead and auto-populate that. And as we saw in this particular module, agreements are a great way to facilitate that. By using agreements, you have the ability to auto-create work orders and even bookings on a very specific predefined schedule, and you can have multiple schedules per agreement based upon what you want to work with. Now, a lot of times when you're selling products and services to your customers, you're selling those as part of your sales life cycle. So the other thing is, you can attach agreements to quotes and orders and opportunities, and you can utilize those as part of your selling process, so you can sell these preventative maintenance to your customers, and then you have the capabilities to keep track of them as part of your sales order processing lifecycle. But then also remember to be creative and think about the fact that if you have numerous types of service schedules that need to be accommodated, that can all be done through that single agreement just by creating multiple bookings and then tying those multiple schedules to that single agreement and then activating it and let it running through its sales life cycle course.